Right now, somewhere in your city, a 28-year-old is waking up at 5 in the morning. She drives for a rideshare company until 9. Then she walks into her actual job, an office gig that pays her $52,000 a year. At 6 p.m., she goes home, eats something fast, and opens her laptop to do freelance graphic design until midnight. 3 income streams, 60, 70 hours a week. And she still cannot afford a one-bedroom apartment without a roommate. Meanwhile, a hedge fund manager in Connecticut just made more money while he slept last night than she will make this entire year. Not because he worked harder, not because he is smarter, but because of where he is standing. That is not a metaphor. That is the entire point of this video. There is an economic principle that was written down in 1755, 2 full decades before Adam Smith published anything, that explains exactly why the harder ordinary people work right now, the further behind they fall. It was written by a man most people have never heard of, an Irish-French banker named Richard Cantillon. And what he figured out nearly 3 centuries ago is so uncomfortable, so structurally damning, that it has been mostly left out of mainstream economics education ever since. Here is the short version. When new money enters an economy, it does not arrive everywhere at once. It enters at a specific point, and the people standing closest to that point get to spend it before prices have adjusted. Everyone else receives that same money later, after prices have already been driven up by the people who got it first. Cantillon called this an observation about the nature of trade. Modern economists call it the Cantillon Effect. But I think a more honest name for what it actually does to working people is the proximity trap. Because where you stand in relation to new money determines whether that money builds your life or quietly erodes it. And in the year we are living in right now, when the wealthiest 1% of American households hold 31.7% of all national wealth, the highest share the Federal Reserve has ever recorded since it started tracking this data in 1989. Understanding this trap is not optional anymore. It is survival information. That number is worth sitting with for a second. The top 1%, 31.7% of all the wealth. According to Federal Reserve data from the third quarter of 2025, that top slice held roughly $55 trillion in assets. That is approximately equal to the wealth held by the entire bottom 90% of American households combined. And this is not happening because the bottom 90% stopped working. Americans are working more hours, across more jobs, with more side hustles than at any point in modern history. The effort is there, the output is there, but the reward keeps flowing in one direction. Why? Because the system is not broken. It is functioning exactly the way Richard Cantillon described it would function in 1755, when he was writing by candlelight in Paris, laying out a theory that would be called the cradle of political economy by the British economist William Stanley Jevons over a century later. Cantillon died under mysterious circumstances in 1734. His house in London burned down, and his body was reportedly found inside. Some historians believe he was murdered by a disgruntled cook. Others suspect he faked his death to escape the many lawsuits filed against him by people who lost money on investments he had profited from. His manuscript circulated privately for 20 years before it was finally published in 1755. So, the man who first mapped the invisible architecture of wealth transfer, the man who showed why some people get richer simply by being closer to the source of money, was himself someone who understood proximity better than almost anyone alive. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what he understood. You are going to see the shockwave. You are going to trace it from 1755 through 1971, right into your grocery bill, your rent, and your retirement account. And then we are going to talk about what, if anything, you can actually do about it. Let us start with the stadium. Picture a massive stadium, 100,000 seats, packed. Every single person in that stadium represents someone participating in the economy. Workers, teachers, nurses, small business owners, retirees, gig drivers, freelancers, everyone. Now, right in the center of the field, there is a hose. And that hose is connected to a water tank that never runs dry. That hose represents the central bank. In America, that is the Federal Reserve. The water flowing out of it represents new money being pumped into the economy. Here is the part that matters. The people standing right next to that hose on the field. They get the water first. Fresh, clean, full-pressure water. Who are those people? Major banks, large financial institutions, government contractors, corporations big enough to access cheap credit lines directly from the banking system. They receive new money before anyone else, before prices adjust, before the economy even registers that additional money exists. And with that fresh money, still cold, still powerful, they do the rational thing. They buy. They acquire assets, real estate, equities, commodities, land. They take positions in markets that have not yet reacted to the fact that the money supply just expanded. Now, look up at the bleachers, way up at the top. That is where the regular worker sits. The person with a salary. The person with a fixed hourly wage. The person whose income is negotiated once a year, maybe with a 3 or 4% raise if they are lucky. By the time the water reaches those upper seats, trickling up through layers of economic activity, it is warm, it is diluted, it has lost pressure. And more importantly, by the time that worker receives their modest raise or their small cost of living adjustment, the people on the field have already bid up the price of everything. Housing, food, energy, health care, education. That 3% raise does not keep up with a world where asset prices moved 10, 15, 20%, while the worker was waiting for their annual review. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is just how money supply expansion works when it enters an economy from a single point, rather than being evenly distributed. Cantillon saw this clearly. He wrote about it in plain terms. When new money enters through mining or trade surplus, or, in his era, through the royal court spending lavishly, the first recipients benefit at the expense of the last recipients. The key insight, the one that makes this a trap rather than just an inconvenience, is that inflation does not happen all at once. It travels outward like a shockwave. And the further you are from the origin point, the more damage that wave does to your purchasing power by the time it reaches you. Think about how this actually plays out in real life. A major bank gets access to cheap capital from the Federal Reserve at favorable rates. That bank lends some of that money to a real estate investment firm. The firm uses it to purchase residential properties in growing metro areas. Those purchases drive up housing prices. Rents follow. By the time the nurse who lives in one of those apartments sees a wage bump, her rent has already gone up by more than the bump covers. She is working the same job, possibly harder, and she is further behind. This is not about laziness versus hard work. It is about proximity. Bank of America data from December 2025 showed that higher-income households saw wage growth of about 3%, while middle-income households saw 1.5%, and lower-income households saw just 1.1%. That is not a story about effort. The lower-income worker is not working one-third as hard. The gap exists because income sources closer to financial markets and capital flows grow faster than income sources that depend on fixed wages. And here is where it gets really uncomfortable. The people in the upper seats of that stadium, the workers, the savers, the people doing everything right, They are not just failing to keep up. They are actually funding the gains of the people on the field. Their lost purchasing power is the transfer mechanism. Every dollar that buys less at the grocery store, every rent check that takes a bigger chunk of the paycheck. That value did not vanish. It moved downward in the stadium to the people who spent the new money first. Richard Cantillon understood this in the 1700s. He watched it happen with gold flowing through the courts of France and Spain. But what he could not have predicted is what would happen when the last physical anchor on money creation was removed entirely. That happened on a very specific date. August 15th, 1971. Here is something they probably did not spend much time on in your economics class. For most of modern history, money was tied to something physical: gold. There was a limit to how much money could exist, because there was a limit to how much gold existed. This was not a perfect system. It had problems, but it did one important thing. It kept the hose from running full blast. Under the Bretton Woods Agreement, signed in 1944, the U.S. dollar was pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Other countries pegged their currencies to the dollar. The whole system was built on the promise that if you held U.S. dollars, you could exchange them for gold at that fixed rate. For about 25 years, this worked. The American economy was the strongest in the world. The dollar was trusted. Global trade hummed along, but by the late 1960s, the math stopped adding up. The United States was spending heavily. The Vietnam War, domestic social programs, foreign aid, military bases in dozens of countries, and the Federal Reserve was printing dollars to cover the difference. By 1971, there were 4 times as many U.S. dollars in circulation as there was gold in the reserves to back them. Foreign governments noticed. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, started actively redeeming dollars for physical gold. Other countries followed. U.S. gold reserves dropped from approximately 20,000 tons at peak to just over 8,000 tons. The bluff was being called. On August 13, 1971, President Richard Nixon gathered his top economic advisors at Camp David. Secretary of the Treasury, John Connally. Office of Management and Budget Director, George Shultz. Federal Reserve Chairman, Arthur Burns. Notably absent, the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. This was not treated as a foreign policy decision. It was treated as an emergency financial operation. Over 2 days, they hammered out a plan. And on the evening of August 15th, Nixon went on national television and announced what he called a new economic policy. He suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. He imposed a 10% surcharge on imports. He froze wages and prices for 90 days. He said it was temporary. It was not temporary. The gold window never reopened. The Bretton Woods system collapsed. By 1973, the world's major currencies were floating. Their values determined by markets rather than by any fixed standard. The U.S. dollar became a fiat currency, its value backed by nothing except trust in the government that issued it. Now here is what this has to do with the stadium. Before 1971, the hose in the center of the field had a pressure valve. Gold was that valve. You could only pump so much water because the tank was finite. New money creation was constrained by physical reality. After 1971, the valve was removed. The tank became infinite. The central bank could now create as much money as political and economic circumstances demanded. And in the decades that followed, that is exactly what happened. The dollar has lost over 87% of its purchasing power since 1971. Gold, which was fixed at $35 an ounce under Bretton Woods, reached over $3,000 an ounce in 2025. That is not gold becoming more valuable in any absolute sense. That is the dollar becoming less powerful. Before 1971, a median income earner could buy a home with roughly 2.5 years of savings. Today, it takes over 7 years on average. The median age of a home buyer in the United States climbed to 59. The share of first-time home buyers has fallen by roughly 50% since 2007. These are not random statistics. They are the direct, measurable consequences of removing the pressure valve and turning the hose on full blast, while most of the population sits in the upper bleachers wondering why they keep getting wet but never getting full. The Nixon Shock, as historians call it, was considered a political success. The Dow jumped 33 points the next day, its largest single-day gain at that time. Nixon won re-election in 1972 by a historic landslide. But the economic consequences were devastating. The 1970s brought stagflation, simultaneous high inflation and high unemployment, an outcome that classical economics said was not supposed to be possible. And the proximity trap that Cantillon described in 1755 went from being a slow leak to a fire hose. So let us bring this all the way forward. What does the Cantillon effect look like in a world where there is no gold standard, where central banks can expand the money supply at will, and where financial markets are the primary transmission mechanism for new money? It looks like the world you are living in right now. In January of 2026, CNBC reported that the portion of U.S. GDP going to workers in the form of compensation fell to its lowest level in over 75 years of tracking by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Think about that. The economy has been growing, corporate profits have been hitting records, GDP keeps climbing, but the share of that growth going to the people who actually produce things is shrinking. Where is it going? To asset holders, to the people on the field. The top 10% of income earners in America now account for nearly half of all consumer spending, 49.2%, up from 43% in 2020, according to Moody's analytics. The economy is not just unequal, it is structurally dependent on the spending of wealthy households. If those households pulled back, the entire consumer economy would contract. And here is the mechanism that Cantillon described 3 centuries ago, playing out in high definition. The stock market posted strong gains through 2024 and 2025, driven heavily by artificial intelligence investments. According to Gallup, 87% of Americans who own stocks live in households earning $100,000 or more. So when asset prices rise, the benefits flow disproportionately to the people who already had assets. The people on the field. Meanwhile, middle-class wealth is mostly tied up in housing, and home price growth has been slowing. Lower-income Americans are carrying higher debt loads, the gap between those closest to financial. This is what economists mean when they talk about the K-shaped economy. 2 lines diverging. The upper line, asset-rich households, shoots up. The lower line, wage-dependent households, stays flat or curves downward in real terms. The confidence gap between how the highest and lowest earners feel about their financial situation grew to its widest point in over a decade during 2025, according to the University of Michigan's surveys of consumers. That is not just an opinion. That is people accurately sensing what the data confirms. If you earn wages and hold no significant assets, the economy is not working for you. Not because it is broken, because you are sitting in the wrong seat. Now, some people hear this, and their instinct is to say, well, that is just how markets work. People who invest do better than people who do not. And that is true at a surface level, but it misses the critical structural point. The question is not whether investing is smart. Obviously it is. The question is, why has it become nearly mandatory just to avoid falling behind? Before 1971, you could put money in a savings account, and it would roughly hold its value. A dollar saved was approximately a dollar preserved. The interest rate on savings broadly tracked inflation. Ordinary people did not need to become amateur stock market participants just to maintain purchasing power. After 1971, saving money in a bank account became a guaranteed losing strategy. Inflation consistently exceeded savings rates. The only way to preserve wealth, let alone grow it, was to put money into assets whose prices were being inflated by the same monetary expansion that was eroding cash. That is the proximity trap in its most refined form. The system creates the problem, currency devaluation, and then offers you a solution, invest in markets, that by its structure benefits the people closest to those markets the most. The nurse in the upper bleachers is told to open a brokerage account and buy index funds, and that is genuinely better than doing nothing. But the hedge fund on the field floor is leveraging cheap institutional credit to buy the same assets at scale, months or years earlier, at lower prices. Same game. Radically different starting positions. Let us talk about something that should make a lot more sense now. The entire culture around hustle, grind, side income, multiple revenue streams, the glorification of working yourself into exhaustion, all of it exists inside the proximity trap. When a 26-year-old in 2026 is told that the path to financial freedom is to work a day job, drive for a ride share at night, sell digital products on weekends, and invest whatever scraps are left into an index fund, that is not empowerment. That is a symptom. It is the economy telling people that a single full-time job no longer purchases what a single full-time job used to purchase. That the floor has dropped. That the only way to maintain something resembling a middle-class life is to become a one-person economic engine, running at maximum capacity. And the terrible irony is this: the more people enter the gig economy to supplement their income, the more labor supply increases, which pushes individual gig earnings down, which means each hour of side hustle labor is worth less. Meanwhile, the assets they are trying to earn enough to buy, housing, retirement funds, education for their children, keep getting more expensive. It is a treadmill. The speed keeps increasing, and the destination keeps moving further away. This is not about personal responsibility. Personal responsibility matters. Financial literacy matters. Good decisions matter. But no amount of personal responsibility can overcome a structural system where the value of your wages is being diluted faster than your wages are growing. Between 1979 and 2025, wages for workers at the 10th percentile, that is, the workers earning less than 90% of all earners, grew 28.6%. Sounds decent, until you look at the other end. Wages at the 90th percentile grew 64.1% over the same period. And the Economic Policy Institute notes that the even faster growth of the top 1% cannot even be captured by standard wage surveys. Their income comes from capital gains, equity stakes, and financial instruments that do not show up in payroll data. 28% growth across almost 5 decades for the lowest earners, 64% for the top, and uncountable growth for the very top. That is not a wage market functioning normally. That is the Cantillon Shockwave traveling outward in slow motion across an entire generation. And here is the cultural damage. When people at the bottom of the wage distribution cannot get ahead no matter how hard they work, 2 narratives emerge. The first narrative says, "Work harder, you are not doing enough." The second narrative says, "The system is rigged, why bother trying at all?" Both narratives are destructive. Both miss the structural point. The real answer is more nuanced. The system has a design. That design was described in 1755. It was accelerated in 1971, and it is operating at full speed right now. You cannot outwork it. You cannot grind your way past it. You cannot budget your way around it. But you can understand it. And understanding it changes the decisions you make. Because here is what the people on the field, the ones closest to the money hose, have always understood. They do not work for money. They position themselves to receive money. They own things that appreciate. They hold assets that absorb new liquidity. They structure their lives not around earning more dollars, but around owning things that the expanding money supply makes more expensive. That is not some secret conspiracy. It is just the logical response to understanding how the system works. And the good news, maybe the only good news in this whole conversation, is that understanding it is not gated behind a finance degree or a family trust fund. So let us talk about what stepping outside the shockwave actually looks like. I want to be careful here. This is not financial advice. I am not qualified to tell you what to invest in. What I can do is lay out the historical pattern of how people have protected themselves from the exact mechanism we have been discussing. The core principle is simple. You cannot outwork the proximity trap because the trap operates on your purchasing power, not your effort. Working more hours earns more dollars, but if those dollars are losing value faster than you can earn them, more hours just means more time on a treadmill. The historical escape route has always been the same. Transition from holding depreciating currency to holding appreciating assets. Move from the bleachers toward the field. Not by becoming a banker or getting a government contract, but by owning things that absorb the shockwave rather than being eroded by it. Historically, what has absorbed monetary expansion? Real estate has been the most common vehicle. Property values tend to rise with monetary expansion because housing supply is limited and new money flows aggressively into real estate. This is exactly why home prices have outpaced wages so dramatically since 1971. For the people who already own homes, that is a wealth generator. For the people trying to buy their first home, it is a wall getting taller every year. The difficult reality is that real estate is one of the clearest examples of the proximity trap in action. The people who got in early benefited from the exact mechanism that now locks others out. Equities, stocks, index funds, ownership stakes in businesses have also historically outpaced inflation over long periods. The logic is the same. When the money supply expands, that money flows into corporate revenues, asset valuations, and equity markets. Owning a piece of those markets means the expansion lifts you rather than passing you by. The data supports this. Retirement accounts and equity investments have become essentially mandatory for the American middle class to maintain purchasing power. The shift from defined benefit pensions to 401k plans in the 1980s put the responsibility on individuals to manage their own investment exposure. That shift was, in effect, the system acknowledging that saving cash would no longer be sufficient. Then there are hard assets with natural supply constraints. Precious metals have functioned as stores of value across centuries. Gold went from $35 an ounce in 1971 to over $3,000 in 2025. That trajectory tracks the expansion of the money supply almost perfectly. Silver, agricultural land, and other physically constrained resources follow similar patterns. The point is not that any one of these is the right answer. The point is the principle behind all of them. When money can be created without limit, anything that cannot be created without limit becomes relatively more valuable over time. But there is a third category that I think matters even more, especially for people who are starting from scratch without existing assets. And that is owning something that generates income, a small business, a digital product, a skill set that gives you pricing power, meaning you can raise your rates as costs rise because what you offer is scarce or specialized. Freelance work that is positioned upstream in the economic chain rather than downstream. Consulting rather than hourly labor. Service businesses that scale. Content that produces recurring revenue. This is not a motivational speech. This is just the math. If your only source of income is a fixed wage paid in depreciating currency, you are structurally positioned in the outer ring of the shockwave. Every year, the erosion gets worse. If even a portion of your income comes from owning something, whether that is equity in a business, revenue from a digital asset, rental income from property, or returns from investments, you are moving closer to the center. Not all the way. The average person is never going to stand next to the hose. The institutional players, the banks, the sovereign wealth funds, they will always be closest. But there is a massive difference between standing at the top of the bleachers and standing at field level. Moving even a few rows closer to the money changes the math dramatically. And the first step in moving is the one we took today. Understanding where the money enters, understanding why it matters, understanding that this is not random. Let me bring this back to where we started. That 28-year-old driving at 5 a.m., working all day, freelancing all night. She is not lazy. She is not bad with money. She is not making poor decisions. She is caught inside a 270-year-old economic structure that was first described by a man who was so good at understanding money that people may have actually killed him over it. Richard Cantillon wrote his essay Sur la nature du commerce en général around 1730. He had watched John Law's Mississippi Company bubble, inflate, and collapse in France. He had watched people closest to the scheme get rich, while people furthest from it went bankrupt. And he understood something that most people still do not understand today, that the creation of new money is not a neutral event. It has winners and losers, and the winners are determined not by merit, but by proximity. That manuscript circulated privately for 2 decades before it was published in 1755. Economists would later credit it as the first complete treatise on economics. Murray Rothbard called Cantillon the founding father of modern economics. William Stanley Jevons called his essay the cradle of political economy. And yet most people have never heard his name. Maybe that is because the insight is too clean, too clear, too structurally threatening. If the public broadly understood that every round of monetary expansion systematically transfers wealth from those furthest from the financial system to those closest to it, the political conversation around money would change overnight. But understanding does not require a revolution. It requires clarity. Here is what we covered. New money enters the economy at a specific point, through the banking system and financial markets. The people closest to that entry point get to spend it first, while prices are still low. By the time that money trickles out to wage earners, prices have already been driven up. This is the Cantillon Effect, and it has been in operation for centuries. In 1755, the mechanism was limited by the physical constraints of gold and silver. In 1971, when Nixon severed the dollar from gold, the last physical constraint was removed. Since then, the U.S. dollar has lost over 87% of its purchasing power. The top 1% of American households now hold nearly 32% of all national wealth, a record. The bottom 50% hold 2.5%. The share of GDP going to worker compensation has hit a 75-year low. These are not unrelated data points. They are the proximity trap running at full speed. The people on the field, the institutions, the banks, the funds, are not evil. They are simply responding rationally to the incentive structure of the system. And the people in the bleachers, the workers, the savers, the families, are also responding rationally. They are working harder because working harder is what they have been told to do. But working harder, within a system that devalues your wages faster than it increases them, is a losing formula. The way out is not to work harder inside the trap. It is to step outside its radius, to understand the shockwave and position yourself so that it works with you rather than against you, to own things rather than just earn things, to build income streams that appreciate rather than depreciate, to stop trading all of your time for a currency that is, by design, losing value. This is not pessimism. This is the most optimistic framing I can offer. Because if the system were truly random, if there were no pattern, no mechanism, no logic to who gets ahead and who falls behind, then there would be nothing you could do about it. But there is a pattern. Cantillon found it. And once you see it, you can start making different decisions. Not easy decisions, not comfortable decisions, but informed ones. So here is my question for you, and I actually want to hear your answer in the comments. Where do you feel the proximity trap hitting the hardest in your own life right now? Is it rent? Groceries? Healthcare? Trying to save for a home that keeps getting more expensive? I want to know, because every single one of those pressure points traces back to the same mechanism. And the more clearly we can name it, the more precisely we can think about it. That is it for this one. If this helped you see something you had not seen before, you know what to do. And I will see you in the next one.